military training special program. This was really a propaganda outfit, and I was in on some of the organization's activities, and a couple of times I was sent out to make talks about what I thought about this organization, and I thought it was a good idea. We had a very, very interesting time at Fort Knox. Robert at that time was about 4, I guess. One of the things he did was he found a sickle someplace, and one of the other residents was very much upset with me because Robert had a sickle that he was swinging around. Of course, he was very dangerous, and I had to take that away from him and hide it. Then another time, he and another buddy decided to spend the night out in one of the brick ovens that dotted the area. Got dark, no Robert. I went out calling, "Robert, Robert, Robert." Found I heard a little noise near one of these things, and there was Robert and this boy, this fellow, in this oven. They were going to spend the night in this oven. Catherine had a accident. She was coming down the steps with Martha in her arms, and she tripped. And Martha fell out of her arms and fell towards the floor, and I happened to be there and caught her and saved her from having some real serious problems. But that was just one of the things. The stay at Fort Knox was interesting, but it was just another assignment, and we lived there happily and successfully for a couple of years. It is now the 7th of January, 1915. I've just come back from breakfast. There's an epidemic here in assisted living. The number of people who were at breakfast was very small. Most of them were staying in bed. I was asked if I had had a sickness or vomiting, and I told them no. Of course, I was all right. So I'm free at this time to go back across the room, across the street, and I will do that just a short time. We were on leave from the Universal Military Training Experimental Unit at Fort Knox. We went to Durham, North Carolina, to find a place to live since I was going to be assigned there for a school year. We searched around and found a nice little house that was being built and was almost completed and built not too far from the campus. So we made arrangements with the whomever, signed a contract, and we went on leave expecting our furniture to be moved there to a certain date as we agreed upon with the builder and the owner. And we came back from leave expecting our furniture to be already in the house, delivered. To our dismay, it had been delivered from Fort Knox to Durham and placed in storage because the little house wasn't finished for occupancy. It took several days. I don't know how we handled it. I can't remember whether we went to a hotel or whether we went back to Southwest Virginia and lived with the parents. But after another agreed upon date, we came to Durham to find that the furniture was now in the house. We now were the occupants, and we could begin living as students that do. I think back. I'll pause right there to kind of get myself what I was going to say. We moved into the house. Catherine, of course, was pregnant with Catherine was pregnant with Kathy, but she set things up, and I went out to Duke, and I became a college student again. Joined the choir, became active in funny things, and I look back on it now with some shame because poor Catherine was left to handle things by herself, being with 2 young children and pregnant with a third. Anyway, we lived there. Nothing extra happened. And at the end of the year, I went back up to before the end of the year, I went back to the chief of chaplains in Washington and asked him if he could leave me in the States until Kathy's birth. I knew I was on schedule to go to Japan, and I was hoping that I could delay that until Catherine had delivered. He agreed and sent me out to Fort there right outside of Alexandria to be the post chaplain. I can't think of it anymore. I'll think of it later. This time again, we put up, when the school year was over, Catherine and the children went down to Dunsville to live there, and I had to report to the new post. I was a little anxious about the situation. I was figured that the baby was going to come just about the time that they could reordered me to Japan. And so I kind of pushed as much as I could to try to get a quarters, but that was not possible. Anyway, in time, we got quarters. They were old quarters, spacious quarters, very comfortable, and this was 2 or 3 weeks before Catherine arrived. When the time came when Catherine went into labor, I took her to the hospital, and I can't remember what I did then. I stayed over there or what I did, but anyway, she delivered Kathy, and we had a third child at that time living at Fort Knox. Not Fort Knox, at this place. I can't think that name. And I guess we lived there almost a year. An incident that happened there, I think I may have mentioned it previously, about Martha being bit on the arm. This was where that took place. As I say, it was first time that I've seen Catherine really angry, and she was just furious at what had happened to Martha. Anyway, the time came when that tour was over too. I just covered the tours, and we took Catherine with 3 children back to Southwest Virginia, and by that time we had a new Ford automobile, and I was going to drive across country, taking Catherine with me, Robert too, Ralph and Melissa. It was supposed to be a kind of a trip for them. So after a stay at Southwest Virginia with the grandparents, we loaded up the car. I'm on my way to Japan with Catherine, Robert, Melissa, and Ralph in the car to drive across country. Nothing exciting or troublesome happened on that trip, except one incident. We had bought Robert a pair of cowboy boots. He just thought they were the most wonderful things in the world. And after about a week of wearing them, wherever we were, on the way after we had left our sleeping place that night, we were on the road, had driven about 50 miles, when the question of Robert's boots came up. And lo and behold, we found out that he had left them back where we had spent the night before. I was upset. But not much we could do but turn around and go back and get the boots. So that was the only incident to mar our trip. It was a very nice trip. We got along very well. We traveled as we had to get there. And when we got to the San Francisco area, Robert and Catherine stayed a couple of days, and then I put them on the plane to fly back to Southwest Virginia. Ralph and Melissa had left us after we arrived in San Francisco, and the time came when I was alone waiting for transport, which came up eventually, and we loaded onto the troop carrier to go to Japan. The trip to Japan took about 7 days. The family, I was to go to Japan by myself, and the family was going to come in about 6 months. So I didn't really worry about the time. I figured 6 months is not too long. So we finally got to Japan. I was met by my boss, Frank Toby, and taken up to the center of activities there, and billeted. And I was given a billet in what had been a former hotel. 8 meals in the dining room, and walked to and from my place of occupancy for the job. I don't know how many weeks it was. It wasn't too long before there was the beginning of the battle in South Korea, and they my boss pulled him out and made him the senior chaplain for a new unit that was going to try to go pull an end run in Incheon. So I had my job on the 3rd floor and his job on the 1st floor to carry on, and we thought temporarily, but that's what we had to do. It was a very lonely period. I had no companionship. I did call a bingo for the happening that took place on the 3rd floor, or 3rd floor of this school, of this building where we call the finance building. And we had services on Sunday morning in the chapel. And we had services on Sunday night. Then after the services, several of the participants, most of whom were enlisted men, and I went down to the cafeteria and had a Coca-Cola or something. One of the major activities that I had placed upon me at that time was that MacArthur had decided that the men could marry Japanese girls where previously it was not allowed. And the chaplain had to interview each couple, not to give a recommendation, but just to interview them and discuss the problems and so forth. And so I had my job on the 3rd floor and his job, Frank Toby's job, on the 1st floor, and I would interview at least 8 couples a day in addition to do whatever else I had to do. I have to say that being without my family was not a very easy period. I wandered about the city by myself. I had no fear of anything happening. a lot of building was going on at that time. Things continued, and I found out I should have gone back to the period right after that when the war with Korea started, and so it was not known when the families would come. So I had nothing to look forward to, where previously we had expected them in 6 months. Now they had no one had any idea how long they would be there. So that was where I was for a period of time in the beginning of the tour in Japan. I don't know how long it was before there was a change in the ability of families to travel. I think it was at least 18 months, because the war in South Korea had gone on, the Incheon invasion had gone on. I was still doing the job for my boss and for me. But after about 18 months or maybe 2 years, they announced that the families would finally be allowed to join their mates in Japan. I had to extend my stay in Japan in order to have them. So I applied for a job at Grant Heights as the chaplain. Grant Heights was a large housing area where families of service people lived while their spouses went elsewhere to do their job. It was agreed that I would have this position, and eventually I was assigned a house in the area by the size of my family. I was also assigned a Japanese woman. Her name was Mitso. Mitso would live with us and assist Catherine in the rearing of the children. And this was a 2-story building, kind of a development area. I don't know how long it took before they finally got there, but finally Catherine received word to go to San Francisco with the children and take a ship to Yokohama to eventually go to Grant Heights and join me in the quarters that we had there. Their trip from San Francisco to Japan was without major incident. I think they all got seasick, but they traveled all right, and eventually I was found out exactly when the ship would berth in Yokohama, and I should be there to welcome my family to Japan. It was hard to have to wait for things to happen, but it took time, and eventually they did happen, and I went down to Yokohama to meet the ship on which Catherine and the 3 children were traveling. We were taken care of. We went immediately to our quarters in Grant Heights and began to settle in with Mitsu, the Japanese woman, as an added member of the family. Now, she helped Catherine in many ways, but this was a very, very nice situation. At that point in my report, we had gotten to Grant Heights. Family had moved in. Mitsu, the Japanese woman, had joined us. We had nice quarters, large area, and I was challenged no end and was able to do a lot of things. But we had a very enjoyable period there. Catherine was pregnant. That happened on the night of her arrival. We had been so long apart, and it didn't take long to catch up. But she was very enthused by opportunities in the Japanese area. She took art classes, worked in certain ways, and we have many things now among the family that she acquired while we were there. We stayed in Japan for about, I think it's about 18 months. The only sad thing that happened was to receive a phone call one day from Southwest Virginia that Catherine's father had died very suddenly in working in the tobacco fields. She was very clear to him, and I thought she would want to go home immediately, but we already had orders to go back to the States, and she decided that she couldn't do anything by going there, but she could just get the family there. So we didn't follow up on that, on her father's death, but we went home, and I ordered a car from the States to be delivered to me in Detroit. And so we flew from San Francisco to Denver to be with Fred and Judy and that family for 2 or 3 days, and then continued our flight on west, got to Chicago. Robert and I got off the plane, left Alma and the children on the plane. They went on to Southwest Virginia, where the family, what's left of the family, met them. And Robert and I went up to Green Bay, Wisconsin, to pick up this new car. I should have gotten a license before I left Japan to put on the car when I got it new. But here I had the car and no license. So what to do? But I just made a placard and put it in the rear window and just said a serviceman on his way home. And we started out. We drove most of the night, got into Lexington. In the morning, I called Dr. Pyatt and invited Robert and me for breakfast. We went there and had a nice visit. Then we went back and continued our trip across the hills of Southwest Virginia to Southwest Virginia to the home, and we gathered with the family there for a reunion. I was very quickly surprised to receive a telephone call from the chief of chaplains that the commanding general of Carlisle Barracks wanted to know where his chaplain was, and that I should report there immediately. So rather than having a vacation of 2 or 3 weeks, which I was supposed to have, I had to take off and go up to Carlisle. I left the family all Southwest Virginia, went up to Carlisle and began to melt myself into the system. I was given quarters, a house, half of a house. Albert Fitch, who had been a prisoner of the Japanese during the war, lived in an adjoining house. And Robert and John, Fitch's son, were very friendly. The family was all there. Jane, of course, had delivered the baby down in Yokohama, Tokyo. Robert was very anxious at that time to have a brother. And so when I called up after the baby had been delivered and told Robert answered the phone, told Robert he had another sister, all he said was, "Doggone it," and hung up the phone. But it was one of the finest things that ever happened to us, because through the years, Jean has been my right arm, and she has been my right arm here as I stayed in Brandon Oaks area, and she was employed here. So we've had a very good relationship, and I've been very dependent on her for many things, and she's been very grateful to me. Let me stop here and see how it goes. And so we received a nice set of quarters. They were double quarters. A brigadier general named quite think of his name now. Anyway, he had been a prisoner of war in Japan, had very tough times. Alva Fitch was his name. And we settled into Carlisle Barracks and had room for everybody. I don't remember if we had a girl to come to help us at that time or not. Sometime after our arrival, I don't know, it could be children, I visited in the hospital, and I was called one day by the lady in the hospital and say, there's a girl here that's having a great trouble. You need to come over and see her. So I went over, and this was a whack from one of the bases, and she was pregnant. She didn't want to let her parents know, and she was all messed up. Anyway, I counseled her and got her permission to call her parents out in the Midwest. And the mother came and told the girl that she couldn't come home in the situation. And I counted that later to the girl, and I said, when you have to leave the service, if you haven't got other plans, you call me. I'll work out something. Well, she did call me, and I just took her into our home. She was a very nice-looking whack, very pleasant, and so we just made her a senior daughter. And she stayed there with us and lived with us in the same quarters, shared a bedroom with one of the girls until time for her could cause a delivery, so she went. Where did she go? Anyway, she went to a place where they took care of unwed mothers and stayed there and had the baby. She didn't marry the father of the baby, but she married a friend who had been a friend there, and he persuaded her to marry him, and she married him. And they stayed on active duty for years, and she used to communicate with us, but then we lost track after so long a time. Carlisle Barracks was a very interesting place. It was the Army school, and people in the chapel were all lieutenant colonels or colonels, and I used to have singing sessions with the kids, and everything went very well. I had several choirs. Everything was there until orders came sending me back to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to be the division chaplain for the 3rd Armored Division, which was preparing to go to Europe en masse. And I will pick up on that a little bit later. One of the interesting places to be in Carlisle Barracks was having gardens. I had a big garden, 2 units, two sections that they allowed me to have. And we all went down there and we'd work in it. In fact, one summer we had so much in the way of fruit that I took the little red wagon, loaded it down with fruit, and sent Martha and Robert out on the tour of the city selling vegetables. Told them they could keep the money that they could make. And they thought about it, but they did it one time, I think. That's all they did it at that time. I mentioned already that I had to go to Fort Knox, Kentucky. Well, this was a quick unit. In other words, I wasn't planning on it. I hadn't been there at Carlisle Barracks very long before they reassigned me. But we went to Fort Knox. This time, it's the whole family. This time we got old quarters, which had been fixed up very nicely. The Armored Division was a section of the post. People were very loyal to the Lord of the Division and came out there to preaching services and so forth. The family all fit in to what was going on. school for Robert and Martha. I can't remember whether or not Garnet was old enough to start school or not, but we were able to go up to Southwest Virginia now and then to visit the grandparents, which we did. It wasn't too long, too far. And a year's time passed, everything passed very quickly. And came a time when we were all alerted to go up to Brooklyn, get aboard a ship, and go to Europe. This was a new experience for all of us, and we enjoyed it very much. The ship was comfortable. No one got sick, and we landed up in northern Germany. The assistant division chaplain had gone over early and had set up quarters for us, and even had meals all prepared. And we moved into a second or third story quarters. These were multiple quarters, 12 units to a building. I spent a great deal of my time keeping peace among the people because they weren't used to living in this kind of a situation. They turned the dogs out. Of course, the dogs would go to the bathroom without going outside. There was disagreement on what was done, what could be done. I used to have sessions up on the third floor trying to get to peace among all the people. Albert Wildman, who had been the chaplain to whom I had reported when I went on active duty in Fort Jackson, was the Corps chaplain. I said to him one time, if you ever have a preaching assignment, give me a chance. Well, I wasn't with it at Fort Knox. I wasn't at the unit very long, a matter of months, I guess 6 months. He said, how would you like to go to Mannheim? To go to Mannheim? To go to Mannheim?